Muito bom dia. Depois do grande retrato que nos foi pintado por André Blé sobre as grandes tendências e as causas da abstenção, e depois do retrato mais detalhado sobre Portugal de que o João Cancela nos falou, a nossa função agora é um pouco de, para usar esta expressão, partir pedra sobre este assunto. E para fazer isso temos aqui três pessoas que eu vou apresentar rapidamente. A Susan Banducci é professora de Ciência Política na Universidade de Exeter, é também lá diretora do Q-Step Centre, que é um centro de desenvolvimento de investigação e de métodos quantitativos no estudo da realidade política. A Susan Banducci tem muitas publicações e muito trabalho no tema da participação política, da mobilização política e das diferenças sociais que se colocam neste processo de participação política e também na aplicação de métodos computacionais ao estudo do comportamento político. Temos também o Pedro Riera. O Pedro Riera é doutorado em Ciência Política pelo Instituto Universitário Europeu de Florença, foi professor em Strathclyde e hoje é professor de Ciência Política na Universidade Carlos III em Madrid e tem, enfim, para alguém tão jovem, um vasto conjunto de publicações sobre estes temas da participação política, do comportamento eleitoral e, para além disso, também já nos fez no Instituto de Ciências Sociais, já nos deu o prazer de poder contar com a presença dele durante alguns meses. E temos também o Pedro Vicente. O Pedro Vicente é da casa, o Pedro Vicente é economista, é doutorado pela Universidade de Chicago, é alguém que tem trabalhado muito nas áreas do desenvolvimento, é diretor do Novafrica, aqui na Universidade, na Nova School of Business and Economics, e tem trabalhado muito sobre temas de desenvolvimento em países africanos, na Guiné-Bissau, em Moçambique, em Angola, mas também em formas, especialmente nestes países, de aumentar o envolvimento e a participação política. E, portanto, é o nosso excelente painel para discutir estes assuntos. Eu peço-vos desculpa agora, vou passar para inglês e o debate vai decorrer em inglês, mas queria dizer que na parte de perguntas e respostas se sintam à vontade para fazer perguntas em inglês ou português, porque todos temos aqui hipótese, em particular a Susan, de ter a tradução das perguntas de português para inglês. So I'll switch to English. Susan, I would start with you, asking the first question or the first topic. So Andre, one of the things that he talked about in his presentation was about the causes of decline, the causes of turnout decline. And I wanted to ask you, of everything we know and everything you know about what has driven the decline of turnout in democracies, what is the factor that you think should deserve our greatest attention? Which is the one which is most important, not only in the magnitude of effects, but we should be particularly concerned with?
Great. Well, bon dia, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Very important question, and I think obviously the evidence that you've seen in the presentations this morning, overwhelming that turnout is on the decline. And I think the seriousness of it, yes, is worthy of our further consideration. It potentially indicates deconsolidation in democracies. It definitely indicates the lack of legitimacy, perhaps in election outcomes. But I do think from some of the talks that we've seen and from some of the evidence is that we see points in the election cycle and across countries where turnout is higher, higher. And so that, that we see a general decline, but that we do see some increase in turnout at certain elections. So I think if we take those together, there are sort of 4 points that I would think about in terms of the causes of decline. And one of them has already been highlighted already, is that voting is a social act. Obviously, it's a political act, but it is a social act. We vote. One of the drivers of voting is we turn out to vote when we're asked to vote. So there is a very big social dimension to voting. And so when we look at short-term factors like the campaign or political parties mobilizing voters, or even the media telling people that voting is important, we see an increase in turnout when the election is important. But then at the same time, we see a host of factors that are related to the long-term decline of turnout. And I think one of the important ones here, and it's really hard to come to grips with because the evidence, we're gathering evidence about it, but this is the notion that the institutions that are usually there to mobilize voters, those are weakening, I think. We see a weakening of those institutions like political parties, like churches, other community organizations that used to do the work of telling people it was important to vote. So when we look at things like the generational decline in turnout, and that we see the figures that attribute a lot of the decline in turnout over time to the fact that younger generations are not turning out to vote and they're not developing the norms or the habits of voting, we have to understand that they are born into and being socialized as citizens at a time when the institutions are much weaker in terms of supporting the development of voting as a norm. So that's what I would want to focus on those sort of long-term developments about the weakening of institutions. But at the same time, consider that, yes, we can focus on the overall level of turnout and see that it's declined, but we also should pay attention to the inequalities in turnout and the potential that some of those inequalities in turnout, we saw age as a potential inequality, or not a potential, but a real inequality in turnout, big age gap, education. So we see these as predictors of turnout, but we also have to be mindful that they are producing inequalities in the electorate, and these have potential policy implications. So we should focus on the inequalities in turnout as well. And we know there is some evidence that the decline in turnout has also been evidenced in some cases by increasing inequalities in turnout. So the education gap, for example, in some countries is increasing as turnout declines. So we also need to be mindful of that.
Thank you, Susan. Pedro, I would ask you the exact same question. So if when you think about the decline of turnout, where do you zero in? What do you think is the most important thing that we should focus on?
I mean, let me start saying two main things. First of all, I practically agree 100% with what has been said before by Professor Ble or by Professor Banducci. And secondly, that it's very hard to find one single factor that we could identify as a main factor that drives this decline in turnout. But if I had to take one, I would say that maybe there are some institutional determinants of this decline. And in the presentation that we were having before the break, one of the things that has been said, it's about the number of elections. We are increasingly voting more and more and more. I mean, in the case of the European Union, it's clear that 40 years ago, we didn't have a direct election to the European Parliament, and now we have a direct election of the European Parliament. In some countries, we don't have regional elections. Right now, we have a process of devolution, and because of this, people are also electing in these countries their representatives at the regional level. I think that the incorporation of these two additional tiers of elections could be one of the reasons that we are observing this decline, at least in the countries that where this decline is happening. One of the things that I have seen in my own research is that direct elections to the European Parliament have some kind of consequences that were hard to imagine when probably they were introduced 40 years ago, right? Because a part of the fact that they are adding an additional tier of elections, they are adding a tier of elections in which most people are not massively interested in, no? So our idea in the research, in a couple of papers that we have been working on, the ideas that we have had here is that to try to show that people that were politically socialized in this kind of low turnout context, in our case the European Parliament elections, were to some extent acquiring a habit of not voting when a more important election was taking place, in this case the national elections. So I don't know, because the turnout decline here, we have been focusing on Europe, but it has happened in other places of the world. but I think that in the European Union context, we shouldn't neglect the effect of these European Parliament elections. That I think that if I had to say one message, there are more. I think that we will have time to discuss them more in depth. But this could be my first message. Be careful with these institutional reforms that maybe there is a trade-off in terms of it's good that we are electing the European Parliament elections. It's good, to try to democratize the European project, but it has, or it can have some kind of cons that shouldn't be neglected.
Very good. So Pedro Vicente, Susan kind of looked at the generational replacement approach to the decline of turnout as signaling the possibility that these generations live in a context where the old agencies of mobilization don't work as well as they did before. They don't perform the same role. Pedro focused on the multiplication of elections. What's your take?
So thank you, Pedro.
There are 3 Pedros here. I don't know if you noticed. So we'll try to make it simple.
So
yes.
So I feel a little bit of an outsider in this conference, a little bit because I work a lot on Africa. So
yes.
So that's all, and also a little bit from the perspective of economic development. And in economic development, we strongly believe that institutions and politics are very important. So that's how. That's how I'm interested on turnout. So, being a little bit of an outsider and looking at, as an observer of Portugal, an observer of the research that has already been presented and some empirical patterns, I would mention 3 interesting empirical patterns that, as a researcher, I would be very interested on. So one empirical pattern that I think is quite interesting is actually the biggest decline in turnout is in Eastern Europe. So that's really a very, very stark decline. And so I was wondering about, and these are questions, these are not answers. Mm-hmm. I was wondering about whether there is something in common between Portugal and Eastern Europe in terms of being recent democracies, recent processes, maybe recent slight disappointments with democracy and elections. So that would be like my first point of attention when looking at these data. Also, I must say these patterns also happen in Africa. So
yes.
In countries like Angola and Mozambique, abstention increased massively over the last 20 years. And arguably also because of a little bit of disappointment with elections and democracy. So then I'd like to draw some attention to the fact that lower turnout is strictly associated, and this is a correlation, which is something that is very dear to me, the distinction between correlation and something that is more causal. There is this correlation between lower turnout and also a decrease in trust in government. And also, I think this is quite important to mention, because in relatively advanced democracies, with checks and balances, with political accountability, actually we may be facing a little bit of a disease of plenty. So I'll be bringing to this discussion a little bit the positive side. So Portugal is maybe it's not so bad a case. And finally, I'd like to draw attention to another empirical pattern that became interesting to me, which is that within the European Union, the big declines in turnout are really for the smaller countries. So like Portugal or Greece, the largest countries like Spain or France or Germany, they don't see as clear declines. Mm. So that is quite interesting to me. And that brings me to think that maybe it's something related to smaller countries and whether there could be something about the extent to which people think they are a little powerless with respect to the European Union. So these are questions that I'd like to raise.
Sure. So we'll have a chance to get back to some of these aspects, but I wanted to pick on something that Susan started approaching, which is, we are all very concerned about the low turnout, but what is so concerning about it? So why is it a problem? What do we know about the consequences of low turnout? Because we tend to discuss this very much on the civic duty approach that, Andre, we all think it's a bad thing, but why should we think it's a bad thing? What do we know about the consequences of low turnout?
Well, the thing is that here, let me start saying that it depends a lot on who you are asking this question. In this case, you are asking me, but let me say that my personal opinion on this, and then I will go a little bit about the research and the things that we know, is that in principle, it probably shouldn't be a big problem to have low turnout, as long as the people that participate in the election are a good representation of what is the whole country. Meaning by that what do you prefer, an 80% turnout or a 60% turnout? Well, it depends. If the 60% is representing better the country than the 80%, I would prefer the 60%, and then 40% would be able to do other things during the election day, so everyone would be happy. What's the problem here? The problem here is that we know as well that in theory there are some kind of biases introduced by the idea of having low turnout. What biases are these biases? Well, most of the time they are socioeconomic biases. They are social class biases, meaning by that when you have lower turnout, the unequal representation of the different social groups that you find in a country is increasing. And you are going to have that with 60% turnout, you are going to have a higher gap between the turnout rates of higher social class and turnout rates of lower social classes. This is what we have in theory, And because of this, since the 90s, there is a whole literature that has been advocating the idea that political participation or the voice of the people should be loud, should be clear, and should be as equal as possible. What would be the main implication, and then this is the second idea that I would throw of these biases in the turnout rates across social groups? Well, the main implication is that there are some parties that in theory should be advantaged by the vote of some particular social groups, and there are other parties that should be advantaged by the vote of other social groups. So what are these parties? Well, we tend to think that the people that are less prone to participate in the elections are also the people that are more likely to vote for center-left parties. What happens then in reality? That then we go to the empirical evidence, and there's some sort of expectation about the bad consequences for center-left parties of low turnout rates don't show up. So we have comparative evidence that shows that in the end, center-left parties could be also doing well in low turnout scenarios. From the country that I am coming, that is Spain, we have had a whole discussion for the last 15, 20 years of how low turnout rates were benefiting the right-wing party, the main right-wing party, the Conservative Party. And then if you go to the empirical evidence and you start working with this, you realize that in some elections this is true, in some other elections this is not true. The center-left parties can do also very well in low turnout rates scenarios. So the idea is that theoretically, from this point of view of not accurate representation of the different social groups, low turnout could be a bad idea. But be careful, because then in practice, it's not always the case that low turnout rates is having this kind of bad consequences in terms of political representation.
Susan, I wanted to follow up. So you started precisely with this notion that unequal participation is a problem. There's this old argument, I think Schatzschneider was the first person who expressed this, is that it's kind of a vicious circle. Because if you have unequal participation, then political decision-making in the political agenda cares less about those who participate, who don't participate, which means that those who don't participate care even less about. Do you think this is a real possibility? It's a problem?
I agree. I think it is a possibility, and you gave an excellent explanation of why it works or how it would work, but that, yes, the empirical evidence for this actual relationship is very difficult to find. But when we look at cases where enfranchisement is expanded, so where women were introduced, or the vote for women was introduced, we do see policy shifts. Yeah. Or when literacy requirements are removed, we do see increases in government spending. So there is evidence that, yes, and at times where the electorate is expanding, there are policy responses to those new entrants into the electorate. So I agree that, you know, the evidence there about parties and which party is in power and the appeals to the electorate and how that leads to policy outcomes is mixed and difficult to find, but there are these cases where we can identify where increased enfranchisement has led to policy outcomes. And if I come back to because we think about the negative consequences of low turnout, I tried a little exercise for myself if I could think of some negative consequences of high turnout. Sure. And of course, one thing that we always worry about with high turnout is about voter fraud and whether or not actually there is integrity within the electoral process when we have extreme increases in turnout. But that was a little bit cheeky of me to think of that. But I think in terms of thinking about other consequences where we see, or unintended consequences of when we see increases in turnout that might come from initial reforms at increasing turnout, what we see is that it tends to exaggerate the biases in electorates. Or the age bias, or the socioeconomic biases, or the educational biases that we see in the electorate when increases is due to reforms that make voting more convenient. And I think there's a case, if I could just tell you about a story of that I worked on, a case in the US in the state of Oregon where they moved all voting to postal voting. So you voted by post. And it's one of those reforms that's intended to make voting more convenient. It would be similar to early voting, that you can vote whenever you want. And it just makes it simpler, so it should increase turnout. But as suggested, what tends to happen with these reforms, not all of them, but some of those that are focused on convenience, you allow when you open up and you increase the turnout amongst those who are already likely to vote, those who are at high levels of interest or have the characteristics of those who vote often, which tend to be from higher socioeconomic statuses. But it doesn't increase turnout amongst those from lower socioeconomic or those who are disaffected. So those sorts of reforms increase the turnout. Now, what I just read, though, in Oregon, and that's why I thought of this case, is what they did just a year ago is that they made registration for voting universal. So, of course, in the US, they have this crazy system where you first have to register and then you have to go and vote. But what they did was they made registration a barrier to voting. They removed that barrier. And what happened? Turnout did go up, but it went up amongst those groups who were less likely to vote. So it went up for low-income voters, low education voters, those who could not overcome that barrier of registering to vote. Universal registration removed that. So when we think about what do we do, or when we think about reforms, I think we need to think about these consequences of what they may potentially do to turnout, but also what they might do to the composition of the electorate. Because I come back to your point, yes, turnout, equal turnout of 60%, if it's equal across all subgroups of interest, that's great. If it's 80% and there's higher levels of inequality, then we might see a problem.
Sure. Pedro, it's the same question, but I think also appealing to your experience as somebody who has studied development and development strategies in Africa. Do we see, in terms of the outcomes we care about, so prosperity, equality, well-being, do we see effects of low turnout? Or low engagement? Do we see positive effects of increased engagement, increased participation?
So let me make two quick examples
Sure.
from my research. So where I come from in academic terms, we tend to think of turnout as a sign of good political accountability. So political accountability, it's the main concept that we have in mind. So this idea of checks and balances, politicians responding to the electorate. So turnout is not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing in that sense, even though, of course, we all, I think, here in this room think it's, generally speaking, a good sign. Let me give you two very extreme examples. So in one study, this is a study in São Tomé and Príncipe. We did an experiment. By the way, an experiment compares treatment and control, and we are able to be sure that there is causation going on. So, so we run an experiment on an anti-vote buying campaign. So vote buying is a big problem in São Tomé. There is actually a name for it, which is banho. And vote buying is this very clear experience of giving money for votes, cash before the election. And what we found was that this campaign decreased turnout, which means, in another way, that vote buying seems to be increasing turnout in São Tomé. So here is an example in which we are really sure about these in terms of causation. Of course, it's São Tomé, it's not Portugal, but it's actually, São Tomé is actually quite competitive democracy. There is always competition going on, close elections, where actually turnout means that more people driven by vote buying are actually voting, okay? So that is, and to my understanding, vote buying is probably the opposite of political accountability,
Sure.
because vote buying is clearly driving people that are not demanding different policies.
So that's the case where high turnout is actually not necessarily a good sign.
Exactly. So on the other side, we have another stark example. We worked on Nigeria a few years ago. This election in 2007 was probably one of the most violent elections in the world, like top 5 in the last 20 years. And we partnered with an NGO, Action Aid International, which did a grassroots campaign at the community level, trying to get a sense of security to people. And that campaign increased turnout by 7 percentage points. So there you have, of course, that's the opposite case in which actually people are not turning out because they are intimidated, because there is violence going on. So here is like the full range of problems to give a sense of whether turnout could be moving for very different reasons and sometimes very different goodness of reasons. So,
yeah. Susan, I wanted to start with you with a third kind of issue that I think it's important. It has to do with technological change. And it's something that you've done some work. So we've seen in the last few years, it seems like Facebook has been here forever, but it's not that old. Social media, all these modes of interaction, people carrying their cell phones all over the place. Twitter, even today, there's a big controversy about WhatsApp and the Brazilian elections. I mean, all these changes, all these ways of people communicating with each other, all these ways of politicians communicating with people, all these ways of influencing, sometimes not necessarily in legal or normatively appropriate ways, elections. How is this changing? I know this is a question for an entire conference, but how, in short, how is this changing things in terms of participation, do you think?
I think it is. It's a big question. I think there's a great deal of interest in how digital technology has sort of reshaped our experience in the public sphere, but also how it's transforming the way we interact with candidates, with politicians, but also how we access information. And of course, some of us might see great promise in digital technology. It allows us to access a diversity of news sources or information sources. There is no, or less of an editorial gatekeeper in terms of what we see. So we can go beyond what is on the evening news broadcast. We can expand our horizons. It also has it's seen to be, and there are cases of this, a great tool for mobilizing young voters. We've seen cases in the UK where it's increased, various tools have increased registration amongst the young. There was also an app created that for students, it told you, because in the UK you could register where you are a student or you could register at home. The app told you where your more competitive constituency was, so where your vote would matter more, depending on what party you were aligned with, and that increased turnout amongst students. So there's, so some promise. However, the downside, the dark side of digital technology that people talk about is that it does, in terms of information sources, because we select to view, or the argument is there's a selectivity bias. We select news and information that's more consistent with our own views. So there is no cross-cutting effect, really. We don't get exposed to cross-cutting information. This leads to segregation, it leads to polarization, which are negative consequences. So these are these echo chambers, or the algorithms create filter bubbles for us. But the academic studies that have looked at this in depth and have collected the evidence around this have suggested really the echo chamber idea and selectivity and segregation are really overstated, and that selectivity and segregation are not necessarily due to social media platforms. Segregation also occurs in terms of partisan press or partisan broadcasting, so it's not necessarily the result of digital technology. But also at the same time, it is easier to spread misinformation. And just to briefly talk about a study that we are conducting now, which looks at these sorts of questions, we collected data around the EU referendum in the UK and around the general election in 2017. And what we did is we asked people to answer survey questions, but we also asked them to install an app on their phone or on their browser, whatever, so that we could collect their web browsing history data or their clickstream data to really see where they were going online and what they were seeing. So just a couple of observations once we look through all of this massive amount of data, which just are a series of URLs. In terms of the UK, very little fake news. I think of the 3,000 respondents that we have, 9 times out of millions and millions and millions of clicks, only 9 people saw what would be identified as fake news. But also at the same time, very little time devoted to politics in terms of those clicks. Very little time, less than 1% of the clicks. But interestingly, young voters, once we broke it down into news and information site, young voters had a much more balanced diet of news and information. So they were looking across the partisan press, they were looking at broadcast outlets, they were looking at blogs, much more balanced diet in terms of online news exposure than older voters. But I thought for my sort of takeaway, though, was what most people were looking at online when they got to news and information was the BBC, was public broadcasting. That was a shared news experience for everyone across age groups, across political preferences. And we know from other studies that I've worked on and other evidence is that countries where there's public broadcasting and a bigger investment in public broadcasting, greater levels of engagement in politics and greater levels of knowledge about public. So for me, that's a good news story about online news exposure and about the impacts of digital technology. And in fact, it's really good news when well, I think, maybe this is debatable, when politicians, both on the Labour side and the Conservative side in the UK, come out and say what we need to do is to tax big tech, tax them and spend that money on investing in public broadcasting. And I think that's an interesting idea. And then that creates, again, and it builds up an institution which is there, which creates, again, the shared news experience and provides accurate well, and balanced news.
Pedro Vicente, this use of digital communication tools has actually been part of the research design of some studies that you have done. Can you tell us about it?
Yes. So let me just give you a very quick fact. So mobile phone subscriptions in sub-Saharan Africa are 75 per 100, and in Europe it's 123 in 100. So you don't have like a very big difference nowadays
Sure.
in terms of mobile phone access. So let me focus on two experiments that we did with access to technology in terms of trying to get people mobilized to turn out. So one of them is in Mozambique. So this is a few years ago. We actually, so this is an experiment again, and with three treatments, with 3 interventions. So one of them was getting text messages to people, very simple text messages saying, well, this is the day of the election, these are the candidates, please vote. Another one that was actually going on the other direction. So asking people to report electoral problems to a hotline through an SMS. And then we had a more classical mean of communication, which was actually the distribution of a free newspaper at the community level. So what did we see? We see that all 3 interventions increased turnout quite reasonably, something like 5 percentage points in terms of an effect. But all of them had quite different impacts in terms of perceptions of people about politics. So for instance, the hotline created negative perceptions about the election because it was all about problems, while the other interventions were actually creating positive perceptions. So the other thing that we noticed in that study is that the newspaper was actually irreplaceable in some senses, because one thing that the newspaper was able to achieve was actually to give a sense of political accountability to people, which the other 2 did not. So there is a little bit of, even though from this study, even though there is quite a lot that technology can do, there is some other things that it cannot do. The other study that I would like to very briefly mention is a study, it's my exception because it's the only study I did outside Africa, and it's for Portugal, and it's very recent. So this study, we worked, in this study, it was actually the first experiment that happened, to my knowledge, in Portugal around elections. And in this experiment, it was a very simple experiment in the last local elections last year, in which we partnered with ATM machines. So basically with SIBS, the main company in Portugal, on ATMs, which runs something like 13,000 ATM machines, worth 5 billion euros per month in terms of transactions. And this campaign was basically a screen that went on in the days before the election, in last October. And what we find is actually an effect on turnouts. We look at these from the perspective of the civil parish, the freguesia, and we actually find an effect of between 1 decimal point to 6 decimal points in terms of higher turnout when taking into account the intensity of treatment. So this is just to tell you that a very simple, very costless campaign can actually, using electronic means like this, can actually increase turnout, even though it's, of course, a very small magnitude.
Pedro, I mean, it's kind of a message that, in a sense, came from Susan's answer, Susan's response, and also Pedro, that there's always 2 sides to this. I was thinking that Taylor Swift the other day on Instagram said everybody should register. The next day, tens of thousands of people registered. And at the same time, you have politicians, disseminating all kinds of falsities in WhatsApp. So
no, I mean,
can we have a take on this, or it's ambivalent?
No, I think that the economists are basically right when they say that there is not a free lunch, right? And here is another example of this. I mean, there are trade-offs and there are potential interventions from the political point of view that could be also backfire. We are usually very concerned with young people not voting, and we're very concerned because of the fact that you are the citizens of the future, the people that are sitting there. And if you keep going in the same, with the same behaviors that you have been showing in the last decades, in the sense of being less participatory than the older people, we could end up in a situation in 70 years where no one is voting, basically, right? I'm not planning to be here in 70 years, but someone is going to be, and we are going to get that into this situation. So then the solution is, well, why not trying to give so much power or role to the new technologies, okay? And this is when it comes to the question that you were raising. We have some evidence that suggests that new technologies could be good in order to increase turnout. There is this experiment that was run a couple of elections ago in the US, in which they were using this Facebook tool in which you can inform your friends, okay, I voted in this election and this was increasing the turnout rates of the people that were seeing that the other friend was voting, so there could be some effect, but there are downsides of these interventions, and one of the downsides is, again, what I was saying with regard to gaps. There is some evidence that suggests as well that these kind of new technologies, what they could do, a part of the things that we were discussing about polarization, it's basically increasing again the gaps between people that are more likely to vote and people that are less likely to vote. So in the end, new technologies, yeah, we should try it, I think, but being very careful because of the fact that there could be also negative consequences of that.
Very good. So my last question before we move to the audience. Andre's last slide, the title was, what should we do? So it's the kind of question that as an academic I fear, but because now I'm not answering the question, I'm posing it, I'll do this evil thing to you. And I'll start with Pedro. What should we do?
Well, so what I can tell is a little bit about what Andre didn't tell us, because at some point he skipped some slides. So I think I'll tell a little bit about that. So what we know about what works in terms of increasing turnout comes a lot from the experimental literature, and comes a lot from the US, actually, for American elections. This work started in the 90s, pretty much. And by and large, like the main conclusion there is that face-to-face contact in terms of mobilizing voters is very important. So canvassing is very important. Is particularly effective. Now, these interventions could reach, in some studies, they are shown to reach something like 10 percentage points increase in turnout. However, more recent research has kind of underlined that what really matters is personalized contact. So it's not necessarily face-to-face, but personalized contact. So human interaction is really important in terms of political mobilization and namely for participation. So that is to say that like phone calls or mail or email, like massive communication of that kind, is much less effective. And SMS, I've already mentioned SMS. SMS actually are in the middle in terms of. So for the US, there is this very important study that basically shows like a 3 percentage point effect in terms of additional turnout. Now, within this literature, there is something very interesting that people have already mentioned at points, and that I'd like to underline as well, which is this idea that social pressure, like this idea of voting in a group and being part of a group when participating in politics, that may be particularly important. So there is a study that I think is particularly interesting for the US, again, that shows that when people are threatened in commas, they are threatened in terms of, well, we'll tell people about whether you voted or not. And that has a massive impact in terms of turnout. So this idea that people could be a little bit shamed, like Andre was talking about before, that is a driver of turnout. This also appears in a recent Facebook experiment, a massive experiment including 60 million people. It's a very similar conclusion that comes out of that. So that's like the main drivers of turnout. The contents of these messages are typically not as important as the means. The means are more important than the contents, whether you are appealing for different things, different like civic duty, whether the election is closed, etc. So these are like my quick picture of what works in terms of mobilizing voters.
Very good. So Susan, the same question. So Pedro emphasized the mobilization side and certain modes of mobilization. What's your take on what should we do?
I think if I start with my main concern is, yes, about overall levels of turnout, but also with inequalities in turnout. I think that leads me to a similar answer in terms of whatever we can do to increase social pressure in terms of voting and through contact, because it is asking people to vote does get them to turn out and vote. But we have to be careful that that sort of mobilization activity is across the board. So sometimes it happens where we have like the UK or the US where you have single member districts. That sort of party mobilization is directed at only competitive seats where an additional vote will make a difference. But what has to happen is parties have to start mobilizing across the board or get out the vote efforts, or Taylor Swift has to visit every area of the country in order to increase turnout. So it has to be across the board, that sort of personal contact. I also think, if I go back to the recommendation that, or the proposal to tax big tech in order to fund public broadcasting, I think that that does, in a sense, signal that information is important in elections, that informed voters are important. It reduces uncertainty about what election outcomes might bring or what parties might bring. But also, I think it creates an environment, more importantly, and at least in the studies that we've looked at, more importantly, a really rich information environment during a campaign creates the sense that voting is important, such that things like social pressure or when you're being asked to vote have that much more meaning. So I do think aiming at, or reforms that are aimed at increasing information about elections are also important, and the supporting public broadcasting is one potential way.
Very good. Pedro, what would you do?
Yeah, exactly. What must be done, right? Well, let me say the first thing is that I completely agree with Professor André Blais. We should be realistic about our expectations. So there are lots of things that influence the turnout decline that it's going to be very complicated for us, not only to understand, but to change. Having said this, I think that the best thing that we could do is focusing on the institutions, because the institutions are something that it's more, easy to change compared to other types of behaviors of attitudes. What are the institutions that are at hand? Well, maybe starting from less important to more important. There have been some attempts to lower the voting age. Very complicated, very controversial, and not very effective. So there was some excitement when they did this in Austria a couple of years ago. Yeah, this is a solution. We are creating people that are going to be socialized into these pro-participatory attitudes. Then in the end, it happened one election, but then in the next one, it was basically banishing the effect. Second thing, introducing some kind of contents in the school curricula that could, create this kind of pro-participatory attitudes among citizens. This is a possibility. I think that it was more or less in the line that some other people were suggesting. I don't know to what extent it's going to be that effective. Obviously, the main thing here to do is to introduce compulsory voting, but we know that compulsory voting has normative problems, it has lots of political problems, and then in the end, we as scientifics, we should also accept that sometimes we know that compulsory voting affects turnout rates, but we really don't know how it affects turnout rates. And then the last thing, and I'm going to finish with some sort of, let's say, personal anecdote. We have been talking here a lot about turnout decline. There is only one country in Europe Probably there are more, right? And the use of country, I'm going to use it with all the inverted commas that you would like to use, okay? In which turnout decline doesn't exist. What is this country? Catalonia. So what's the lesson that we extract from there? Okay, maybe the levels of political polarization that we have seen in Catalonia in the last years are not acceptable. But it's also true that if voters at some point see that there is meat, in the elections, maybe they are going to react being more likely to vote. So although maybe this could be something that it was against Andres' findings, I think that it's also interesting to have some sort of more salient elections in which voters would perceive that there is higher stakes, and because of this they are more likely to vote.
Thank you. Eu creio que tenho o horário correto na minha cabeça, julgo que temos cerca de meia hora, é bastante tempo, acaba a 1h15, não é? Para perguntas do público e respostas. Eu queria dizer-vos, não se sintam de todos incentivados de colocarem perguntas em português, porque há tradução simultânea. E, portanto, quem é que tem a primeira pergunta, que é sempre a mais difícil? Ali.
Bom dia. O meu nome é Carlos Calado. Não sou investigador na área política, mas tenho feito os meus estudos sobre a abstenção eleitoral. Parece que dá a ideia que o que aqui disseram é que a culpa, entre aspas, a culpa de haver cada vez maior abstenção será dos eleitores, quando de facto parece-me que grande parte do desinteresse dos eleitores se situa do outro lado, do lado dos políticos. Tem a ver muito com a credibilidade dos políticos. Eu, se vou a um restaurante atraído pelo menu e depois de comer aquilo não corresponde nada ao que o menu dizia, eu não volto ao restaurante. Se eu vou votar atraído pelo que os partidos ou as coligações ou quem seja pretende oferecer aos eleitores e depois aquilo que resulta não é nada daquilo que foi prometido, eu deixo de ir votar. Ou pelo menos, ou mudo ou deixo de ir votar.
Muito bem.
E depois temos o outro lado, o lado da lei. O lado da lei eleitoral, que tem aspectos bizarros e absurdos. Por exemplo, no limite do absurdo, se for um único eleitor votar no distrito de Lisboa, não for mais ninguém votar, esse eleitor elege 47 deputados. Isto é absolutamente absurdo. E, portanto, enquanto não for mudada a lei eleitoral, e tenho aqui várias sugestões, pois posso partilhar ao longo do dia, isto não vai mudar.
Muito bem, muito bem. Muito obrigado. Vamos recolher só mais uma ou duas perguntas e depois passar. Estou a ver ali atrás uma mão no ar. Ali.
Bom dia, o meu nome é Carlota e sou do Colégio Marista de Carcavelos e queria perguntar-vos se não consideram importante a possibilidade de frequentarmos a disciplina de Ciência Política no ensino secundário, sendo que em Portugal é opcional, como algo bastante importante para o desenvolvimento e aprofundamento do sentido de responsabilidade em política e cidadania.
Muito obrigado. E mais uma pergunta. A ciência política é sempre para aplaudir. Portanto,
Obrigada.
Havia ali...
Sou eu aqui. Bom dia.
Estou perdido.
Estou aqui.
Aí.
Bom dia, Margarida Rufino, da Escola Secundária de Cascais. Eu penso que nós viemos aqui mais para tentar perceber como combater o absentismo, a abstenção jovem, desculpem. Eu penso que é preciso desenvolver o associativismo juvenil, porque nós professores, reparamos que aqueles jovens que já participam em associações, podem ser desportivas, culturais, quaisquer formas de associações juvenis, já têm mais consciência de participação cívica. E é a partir desta consciência de participação cívica que depois nasce também a noção de participação política. Estamos perante uma geração de jovens, e já há bocado se falou também dos 30 ou 44 anos que a abstenção tinha sofrido um aumento na faixa etária. Estamos perante uma geração de jovens que nasceu em democracia, portanto não tem bem a noção do que é não viver em democracia. E portanto é preciso, acho eu, Cascais até tem uma experiência interessante em termos de associativismo. Eu penso que temos que apostar mais, dar mais condições para o associativismo juvenil, para que se desenvolva então a consciência da participação cívica.
Muito bem, muito obrigado. So just in case, I don't know how the translation works, I'm assuming wonderfully, but just in case, so we have a first comment saying that you guys, and probably all of us, focus too much on the demand side. We didn't focus enough on the supply side. And then a second remark about the Portuguese electoral law, which I think has to do with the fact that we have some very big districts and some very small districts. And then a remark about, well, actually you mentioned this in your last statement, about civic education, what can be done in terms of teaching in high schools to kind of convey the values and norms of participation, and then a comment about the role of youth associations and youth organizations. So, I mean, whatever, I mean, I would start with you, Pedro, and then move your reactions to this.
So, I mean, I'm going to take first, I mean, maybe the first question, okay? So I think that this is very interesting what you were saying. I mean, I completely agree with your concerns, and maybe I didn't make my points enough clear. I think that it's obviously the person that is voting or not voting is the voter, right? So it's the citizen. So for this reason, maybe there was this message that we were sending that we should focus on voters and citizens. But obviously, the determinants of their behavior are not basically confined in their characteristics. There are other contextual factors related to political actors, other, institutions, etc., that could be the main drivers of this turnout decline. So, and this was basically one of the last remarks that I was making. To what extent, if parties offer different platforms and solutions to a problem, and they are radically different, then turnout is going to increase, and it could be the case of Catalonia. So I think that, yeah, it's something that is shared, that maybe because of the way that we explain our theories, it looks like we are making responsible the voters, but, well, first of all, I don't know if we should frame it in terms of responsibility, but if we frame it in terms of responsibility, it's obviously true that it's characteristics of voters, but also the behavior and the actions of political actors that are not only voters. And then the second thing about Portugal, I think that it's fascinating what you were saying, and I think that Pedro was reframing the question in the sense that maybe it's a matter of how big it's the variance in district magnitude, that it's something that Spain and Portugal are sharing, that you have very big districts like Lisbon, or to lesser extent Porto, and then you have very small districts, okay? So this is something that also happens in Spain. And I don't know the answer. I don't know to what extent is this something that we should add to our explanations of why we have turnout rates that are very low in Portugal. It's also true that in Spain, comparatively speaking, we have 10 points higher. It's true that the variance is not that big compared to Portugal, but it's something that we should do research. And then the last thing that you were saying about Lisbon, there are solutions. I don't know to what extent they are feasible. I mean, I'm sure that they are not feasible. But this could be related to the fact that Donald Trump now is president of the United States. If you had a system according to which states with lower turnout rates are losing positions in the Electoral College, maybe Donald Trump today wouldn't be the president of the United States. But no one, I think it's very complicated that politically speaking, this kind of institutional reform is going to be adopted. But the idea is there.
Susan, any response to what you heard?
Yeah, I won't follow it yet to your response about, or to your question about whether or not, or the fact that politicians and political parties are actually and their lack of response to voters actually bears some responsibility for low turnout. I think that's actually, you know, a good point, and probably the way that we've phrased the discussion or framed the discussion. But just to follow up on the point about civic literacy or studies about government and civics lessons should be part of the educational curriculum. And we know that schools are an important socializing agent. So those sorts of lessons learned early on can be very important. They also, I think, provide a way of reinforcing any socialization that goes on in the household or with the family. And so they back each other up. And if you are in a household or a family that is not political or where you're not socialized to civic life, then the school can provide that function. So I think if it's not part of the curriculum, that's one area where early socialization can occur and then be reinforced throughout life.
Pedro Vicente, any reaction?
Yes, so I tend to agree that it's a good hypothesis. So I had talked about a little bit this correlation between lower turnout and lower trust in government, and I think to a certain extent the question speaks to that. It's but looking at it from the bright side, it could be a sign that actually we live in a society with checks and balances, and the society with checks and balances tends to be a society that underlines the dark side. So when the bad behaviors and the good behaviors are kind of left silent a little bit. So to a certain extent, this disappointment could be a little bit coming because of that. On the other points on civic education, and I think these are wonderful points, and I just would like to mention that in Portugal we don't have so much of a tradition of experimenting and actually trying policies, and these are policies that could be easily experimented with.
Yeah.
So we are talking about innovations in schools. We are actually doing a study in Angola where we are working with primary schools in which we do a module, we have a module on civic education. So why don't we do that here? We could do it here, but sometimes it's the science and real acts are a little bit distant from each other. And I think it's very important that in Portugal we create more of a culture of policy evaluation, basically, which is what these questions ask for.
Mm-hmm. Any more? Sorry. Sorry. Any more questions? Yanni.
Hi, my name is Yanni Kardalis. I'm a PhD student at the University of Lisbon. I would like to ask any of you in the panel, do you think there's, if there's any reason to look at it in general, do you think there's any connection between a trending decline in the quality of the political debate? So fake news, fake political news, sensationalism, lack of arguments, insults. If there's any connection between that and voter turnout, or at least the perception of the quality of the debate, I was wondering. Thank you.
Sure. Any more questions? Okay. So there's more? Back there? All the way in the back?
João Lima, I'm a journalist at Bloomberg News. Just a question. You mentioned, I think Professor Banducci mentioned the idea of when voters feel their vote is more valuable or more competitive, there's an inclination to turn out and vote. I wanted to ask if there's any research you're aware of that showed any kind of correlation between democracies which typically have a high proportion of swing voters and turnouts. Meaning if there's a higher proportion of swing votes, people tend to have higher turnout, or could it work the other way around, or there's no evidence of any correlation? Thank you.
Very good. Há uma questão aqui à frente, se não houver ninguém antes. Aqui nesta quarta fila.
Bom dia, Jorge Cancela da Abreu. Estou aqui meramente como curioso, nada, e gostava de ouvir o comentário das pessoas entendidas sobre o fenómeno tiririca e a obrigação de votar.
Já agora vou aproveitar. Bom dia. Tem sido dito ao longo da manhã de que votar é um ato social e, portanto, pode, nessa lógica, ser igualmente um ato familiar. Eu gostaria de saber se tem ideias concretas, à semelhança do que disse ali a Carolina, de como o sistema educativo pode ter um papel na sensibilização de crianças, desde logo, desde a infância, para a importância de participar na comunidade e de como o sistema educativo também pode estabelecer uma ligação entre as crianças e os jovens e as suas famílias, através, por exemplo, através de ideias concretas. Obrigada.
Obrigado. So we have a question about the connection between a possible or actually likely decline in the quality of political debate and turnout, a question about swing voters, if political scientists know anything about any relationship between the amount of swing voters and turnout. Then there was a third question. I was interrupted while you were talking, but I hope you got the question. It was a short question, but I didn't know exactly, I didn't follow that. And then again, picking up on something that was mentioned before and developing it, a question about the connection between the educational system and civic education and engagement. So reactions to this. Anyone?
Can I take the quality of debate and civility in debate? And the evidence that I would use to sort of address that question is one from the area of political advertising, where we know that we have evidence where political advertising that is adversarial or negative, in a way kind of engages voters. Okay, but what you're talking about, I don't think is adversarial, that this candidate says that, that candidate says that, or is negative in that way. What you're talking about is incivility in debate, I think, and this idea about fake news, calling for people to be jailed or thrown in jail or to be, that sort of language. That language, I think, was quite common in the US debate. And I think the studies that are coming in are making arguments on both sides, that it has no effect. And in fact, these ads that are targeted and where incivility in political ads were targeted at particular groups of voters, one side saying, we know this micro-targeting of these sorts of messages has very little effect. And then on the other side, you have people saying, well, actually, that little effect is enough to swing an election, or that the messages, this incivility in debate, is enough to shift the agenda, and at particular times during the course of the campaign, that it did have an impact. So that's an argument that Kathleen Hall Jamieson, I think, is making in her book about the election. And the other argument that this sort of fake news or micro-targeting had little debate is made by Lynn Vavreck and others in the campaign. So I think that's a question, a really important question. It's about the tone of the debate, and it bears further investigation.
So with the second question, I would say that there is a correlation, and this correlation is basically explained by something that we usually study in political science, that it's the identification with a party. So we know that there is a group of people in the electorate that it's decreasing, that usually identifies with a party. what is the electoral behavior of these people? Basically, they tend to vote very often always for the same party, for this party that they are identified with, and secondly, they tend to participate in elections at higher rates than people that are not identified with any party. So my answer would be yes, and probably there would be this variable identification with parties that it's driving both effects.
Pedro?
So let me take the other two questions quickly. The questions on the mandatory voting and the case of Brazil. Actually, there is a study for Brazil that I hope to remember well. I think that probably my colleagues here are probably best to talk about mandatory voting, but my sense is that the big question with respect to mandatory voting is actually the who actually it brings to the election, and there is a little bit of evidence for Brazil specifically that it benefits the wealthier people in terms of because these people are the people that can pay the fees that are required when someone doesn't appear to vote. So I think that the question there is really on who actually benefits from this mandatory voting. The other question on civic education is, what I can tell about that is that we actually did a lot of civic education in different countries, and what we can say, generally speaking, is that it actually works. Okay, so civic education gets people mobilized. Of course, then you can ask whether it's which type of civic education, which means you can use, etc. But generally speaking, there is this sense that civic education works. So very specific ideas will need to be checked because all these studies that relate to evaluating civic education are studies that are very much contextual. So we really need to know that it works for a context that is important for us in terms of decision making, policy decision making. So it's really important again to actually go in the experimenting way. So really embrace this idea that we can try things, we can try new ideas, and that's a knowing to begin with that actually civic education works and can mobilize people.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are getting close to the end and to lunchtime. This was a very interesting debate. We'll have the chance to debate some more of these aspects and others in the afternoon. And I would like to thank, well, first of all, all of you for being here, and the Cascais Mayor's Office and the organization of the conference for all what they have done and provided to us to be here. But first and foremost, I'd like to thank Pedro and Susan and Pedro for their wonderful answers and for helping us thinking about all this. Thank you very much.